the Bildner Visiting Scholar this spring at the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life, and a colleague of mine in the field of East European Jewish history. Specifically, he has worked on Soviet Jewry. Tonight's session, the second session, is called Tevye's Soviet Children from Triumph to Tragedy, 1922 to 1945. So only 2 decades as opposed to last session, which was the long, very long 19th century. The ground rules, I think you know them, but it's always worth repeating. This is the webinar format. All of you are muted. Please do not hesitate to be shy to ask questions in the chat. I will be monitoring them while Professor Deckelhen teaches. And then towards the end, I will collect them and pose them to Professor Deckelhen in not so much the order, but in kind of thematic coherence. As you know, this session is being recorded and it will be uploaded to the Bildner Center website. If you, well, if you're here now, it's irrelevant, but if you want to rehear it or you want to encourage someone to hear it, or you can't, you know, stay for the whole time, so don't worry about that. And also it is, we have closed captions, we have simultaneous auto translation going on at the bottom, and except for foreign words, I hope it's doing a good job. It is a robot, it's not a person, so there may be some typos, but I guess we're all used to that. Professor Deckelhen is going to share his screen and show a PowerPoint, and we also have audio tonight. We are not expecting any technological problems, but there always could be, because that's the way the gremlins work. So thank you very much, and I'm delighted to have you here, even if I can't see you. But I can tell you we have over 120 people on the call, so that's fantastic. And of course, if you have any other questions for the Bildner Center, about our programs or anything else, don't hesitate to shoot us an email and we will, of course, respond. So thank you very much. I'm delighted again to welcome my colleague and friend, Jonathan Deckelhen, to tonight's session.
Well, thank you, Nancy, and thanks to everyone. Good evening. Tonight we'll be covering less ground, but in some ways drilling a little deeper than we did in our previous class. Last week, we talked about the times during which a Tevye type person, he would have lived, could have lived. Today, we're going to look at a new world that his children would have entered after the revolutions in Russia of 1917. And before diving in there, I want to help those who were here last week and those who perhaps weren't, give a brief recap of where now Soviet Jews are in 1917. Well, until then, Jews had been living in Russian-speaking lands from around the 1770s. So they've been in Russian-speaking space now for nearly 150 years. Until the revolutions of 1917, those same Jews had been subjects of the Russian Empire, the Romanov dynasty. And that same dynasty had increasingly restricted Jews to a specific territory, professions, and lots of other restrictions. The Romanovs had even allowed and at times even encouraged anti-Jewish violence, mass violence, that we know now as the pogroms. Most of the Jews who lived in this Russian Empire, they lived in small, insular shtetl communities, and we saw both photographs and artistic versions of what those shtetls look like. But with time, those shtetls, even before 1917, had begun to modernize. And this modernization of the shtetl, it included all sorts of things. They were becoming politicized, certainly the younger people. Secular education in Hebrew, in Russian, and even in Yiddish had begun to take hold. Shtetl Jews were beginning to get into new professions that until the last part of the 19th century really hadn't been known. And more Jews are exiting these shtetls, these small towns, and moving towards and into larger towns and even cities in the Russian Empire. Now, with the coming of revolutions in 1917, an awful lot changed. And what would it be, or what was it like under this new regime to live as a Jew? And give me a moment. Okay, just a second. Okay, and from here I'll be assisted by by this presentation. So what was it like living as a Soviet Jew under this very new regime? Well, first of all, the region where almost all of these Soviet Jews lived was totally devastated by war. Amongst other crises of the region as a whole, and Jews in particular, were hunger and a huge number of orphans. This crisis was addressed in part by these new Soviet Jews themselves, but also by the entrance or the re-entry of Jewish philanthropies from abroad. And here we see two examples: a soup kitchen on the left that was created in Ukraine from earlier, but the photos from 1922, and an aid station from Kremenchug, where Soviet Jews could receive packages from abroad that were relayed to them by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. Now, most of the Ashkenazi Jews who were living at that time in Soviet Russia had been traumatized in one way or another by the pogroms in what is now Soviet Russia between 1919 and 1921. Some numbers that I may not have given last week. There are all kinds of estimates, but if we assume that there were over 5 million Jews in the Russian Empire as these wars were racing through the area, then from the pogroms themselves between 1919 and 1921, somewhere between 70 to 150,000 Jews were massacred. Hundreds of thousands of others were injured, raped, and billions of rubles worth of Jewish property were destroyed by the pogroms themselves. And that's aside from the regular war damage that a civilian population would have to endure under any case. But there are also a lot fewer Jews living now in this Russian-speaking space. Why? Because as a result of three events, the size, especially along the western borders, the size of Soviet Russia, what used to be the Russian Empire, has shrunk. And now, instead of there being 5.5 million Jews in the Russian Empire, there are just over 2 million Jews living in Soviet Russia. Where did the others go? Well, of course, there were some war and pogrom casualties, but most of this occurs as a result of political treaties and arrangements. And as you can see on the slide, first, the end of the First World War with Germany, the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, adjustments as a result of the Russian Civil War, and the Russo-Polish War that I mentioned briefly in our last lessons. Now, like radical socialists everywhere in the world, at that time, the Bolshevik regime was filled with aggressive atheists. So Soviet Jews entering into this new world would have had to have wondered what's going to happen to Judaism, to their synagogues, and to their religious leaders. It's an open question in 1922, once all of the warfare is behind them. Some things are clear, however. One of the first acts of this new Bolshevik regime is to create and pass a new constitution in the year 1918. It has some very severe effects amongst the Jews of the Soviet Union, not because they're Jews, but because in their previous life before the revolution, they were petty traders, money lenders, things that were considered bourgeois by the Soviet regime, and hence somewhere between, we don't know exactly how many, 40 to 70% of all Jews who were living in Soviet Russia as of 1918 became disenfranchised by virtue of that constitution. What did that mean, disenfranchised in the Soviet Union? Well, for one, it meant you got less food because food was rationed at that time. It also meant that you and your children would have much less access to government employment, something that's very important in a planned central economy. It would also mean that you and your children would have less access to higher education. So this was pretty debilitating at the time. Not only that, but the Soviet Union, as of 1918, when it exits the war, betrays Britain and France and England, and signs a separate peace with Germany, Soviet Russia becomes an international pariah without diplomatic ties. And added to that, the Soviet Union has nationalized foreign property and is exporting, and here we get specifically to a Jewish problem, as it were. As of 1918, the Soviet Union is exporting revolution. And the chief agent of this export of evolution, institutionally speaking, is a body that it creates called the Communist International, the Comintern. And the gentleman who heads the Comintern until his very last days is the man we see standing in this car, looking very buoyant and ideologically motivated. His name is Grigory Zinoviev, of course, with a different name that he was born with, a Jewish Bolshevik who was considered at the time one of the most important Bolshevik leaders. Now, the fact that not only Zinoviev, but also many other of the early Bolshevik leaders were of Jewish origins helps to create and then fuel what will be called the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. This idea in the world that socialist revolution was born and then being fed globally and incited globally by a group of Jewish Bolsheviks who now lead the Soviet Union, with Zinoviev, that we see here in the photo, being the prime agent of this change. Now, these new Soviet realities, they do have some upsides for Soviet Jews. First, it's widely recognized that this new regime had been the only force within the Civil War that had actually protected Jews. Few, if any, pogroms were committed under Red Army control. Also, the Pale of Settlement that we talked a lot about last week has been abolished. Jews can move freely around the country now. Also, anti-Semitism has been outlawed. Not only has it been outlawed, but there's a very serious anti-Semitism campaign throughout the country, government funded, and anti-Semites are being prosecuted and even put to death for anti-Semitic crimes. What we see here is a Bolshevik poster publicized sometime between 1927 and 1930 that shows us shows the audience at the time, what would the anti-Semites look like? They can be former army officers, as we see here, former wealthy people, all of this to vilify, demonize anti-Semitism at a time when no other country in the world was doing that. Next, the new regime, the new Bolshevik regime, is accelerating pathways for upward mobility through education and private business. In its first years, the Bolshevik regime actually allows private business, and Jews, given what they've already developed, and we talked about a little bit last week, these commercial capacities are actually able to benefit from this in the first years. But not only that, Jews are recognized widely by the Bolshevik regime and others, and many others within the Soviet society, for their high literacy rates in Russian, and their reputation for being brainy, for being very energetic, and being sober. Sounds funny, but it's true. In Russian, Soviet, and post-Soviet society, this issue of sobriety is very, very serious. Then, as a result of all these, they're seen as trustworthy workers and managers, especially managers by the Soviet regime. All of this contributes to what becomes in the 1920s a meteoric rise in the status of Jews in this new Soviet economy and educational system. Now, diplomatic relations, we talked about them being severed in 1918. They're only renewed in 1932 and 1933. Soviet Union is welcomed back into the family of nations, into the League of Nations at the time. But as early as 1919, the Soviet Union allows the foreign Jewish philanthropies, organizations like the Joint Distribution Committee, ORT, that we mentioned last week, and a number of others, to operate freely in the Soviet Union and provide aid and development to Jews and to non-Jews within the Soviet Union, and we'll understand the impact of that shortly. But the most pressing question for Soviet Jews and those observing Soviet Jews from outside in 1918 is how to restore the civil rights that were taken away from them by way of the 1918 Constitution. Again, somewhere between 40 and 70% are disenfranchised. Well, the Soviets had a rule for this. They had rules for pretty much everything. And the rule was that in order to restore yours and your family's enfranchisement, you had to perform 2 to 3 years of productive labor in either industry or agriculture. And into this need stepped the regime itself, but more importantly, or just as importantly, these foreign philanthropies who begin to cooperate with the Bolshevik regime in creating two extensive and very expensive programs. One was for industrial or vocational training, meaning creating training centers, schools to teach Jews, young Jews mainly, but not so young as well, how to work a metal lathe, how to become a drafter, how to become any number of specific trades so that they could get engaged in what was a slowly, very slowly recovering Soviet industry at the time. But the other thing that they decide to do, especially the foreign philanthropies, is to create Jewish agriculturalists out of what they hoped would be hundreds of thousands of these impoverished, disenfranchised Jews. How would they do that? They would build upon the colonies that had been established, and we talked about these last week, the Jewish farming colonies that had been established as far back as Tsar Alexander I in southern Ukraine, but they would expand upon it with massive, massive investment. And they would expand both in place, but also into northern Crimea. And here we see a partial map of the sites of this colonization. All of the small dots, and we see about 4 dozen here, are Jewish colonies that were created sometime or expanded upon sometime between 1922 and 1941. So from just after the end of the Civil War until the invasion of the German army in 1941 in this part of the world. And as we can see, and this is only a small part of these colonies, in all, in southern Ukraine and northern Crimea, there were nearly 200 of these Jewish colonies, most of them completely new. Others were expansions of the original colonies from Tsarist times, and that would total something around 200,000 Jewish colonists, all of whom were resettled there by these settlement organizations from the former Pale of Settlement into these colonies. Here I'm going to show you some images. This, we can see, was an annual report published by OZ. OZ was a Soviet Jewish administrative organization that was created to promote Jewish agricultural life. And as you can see, it's beautifully illustrated and called The Jewish Peasant. It gave all kinds of information about what was going on, and also instruction for the local Jews as to how to plow and seed and such things. Here we see a nice image of young Jewish farmers in the area in Crimea, late 1920s. And if you didn't know better, you would think that these are photos from Palestine, but they're not. They're from northern Crimea, around the same time that we would be used to seeing the pioneering photos of early Zionist settlement in Palestine. And here we go back to an old friend, Issachar Ribak, that we met last week, painting pogroms in Kiev. And here in 1926, he's painting in situ. He's there painting rather romantic shots of life in southern Ukraine. He goes there at the behest of the Joint Distribution Committee, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which underwrote, funded, and supported these colonies, or most of them, creating a smaller organization called the Agro Joint to do all of this. They sent Rybak here in order to get an artistic rendering of what was going on in the very early stages of agricultural settlement. And at this point, what I'd like to do in a moment, Nancy, is just in a moment, I'm just prepping you to hear some music from the time. These colonies became an international phenomenon. They were known all over, certainly the Jewish world, and an anthem was produced from them locally that became a kind of global hit in Jewish communities, translated into several different languages where there are substantial Jewish communities. And I'm going to show you now a recent, relatively recent, performance of that song in Yiddish and in English, performed by the Travelers, a well-known folk group of the 60s and the 70s. Nancy, please play the recording.
For there's a little railroad depot known quite well by all the people, and it's called John Coy, yeah, John. The chorus, if you know it. Hey John Coy, hey John Billy, hey John Coy, hey John Coy, John, John, John. Hey John Coy, hey John Billy, hey John Coy, hey John Coy, John, John, John. Fährt jeden auf mein Kasche, wo's mein Bruder, wo's der Brasche, es geht bei ihm der Traktor wie er Bahn. Die Mummelei bei der Kassuke, Bela mit der Molotulke, in English now. Now, if you look for paradise, you'll see it there before your eyes. Stop your search and go no further on. For here we have a collective farm all run by husky Jewish arms, and it's called John Coy, yeah, John. Hey John Coy, hey John, hey John Coy, hey John Coy, John, John, John. Hey John Coy, hey John Billy, hey John Coy, hey John Coy, John, John, John. Wer sagt, dass jeden kennen, nur handeln, essen, fette Jäuf mit Mandeln, noch nicht sein kein Arbeitsmann. Das kennen sagen nur die Sonnen, jeden schweigt sie an den Tonnen. Gitter Cook, John, John, John. In English, well, Aunt Natasha drives the tractor, Grandma runs the cream extractor. While we work, we all can sing our song. Who says that Jews cannot be farmers? Spit in their eyes, who would so harm us? Tell them of John Coy, hey John. Hey John Coy, hey John, hey John Coy, hey John Coy, John, John, John. Hey John Coy, hey John Billy, hey John Coy, hey John Coy, John, John, John. Pete, when he had his sabbatical, which ended up as a mondicle and a Tuesdicle, because they were blacklisted, the Weavers were. He went off to the Soviet Union, went to the Ukraine, found some people there. He went to the Stanция, the railroad station where people go to, found some people that still knew the song, came back and wrote his own verse. Not many people know this one. Somehow I heard it from Pete. Went like this. Work together all as brothers, Jew and Gentile, white and Negro, for a better world to come. All must work, for work is good. In work may man find brotherhood, as in John Coy, John, John, John. Everybody sings now. Hey John Coy, hey John Billy, hey John Coy, hey John Coy, John, John, John. Hey John Coy, hey John Billy, hey John Coy, hey John Coy, John, John, John.
Okay, great. Listen, I promise I will make sure that the link to that YouTube is distributed to everyone so that you'll be able to see it in full later on. I know there are lots of questions about this, but time is short, so I really can't stop to answer many of them. We'll see what time remains at the end of class today. The Pete that he was referring to towards the end with the new verse, that's of course Pete Seeger, who popularized the song to some degree in the United States in the 1960s. So 30, 40 years after it had initially been popularized, forgotten, and then renewed by Pete Seeger. John Coy, the name of the song, however, and that should be, that is an important thing for us to look at. If you give me a moment, I'll show you exactly what John Coy is. Just a moment. Oops. Okay, John Coy is here. It's this town, small town in northern Crimea, where the train, most of the new settlers, the resettled people coming from the Pale of Settlement north up here, either came down by horse and wagon, quite literally, or by train. All of them passed through Jankoy, and as you can see, a lot of these colonies were concentrated around Jankoy. So the name of the song is a direct reference to Jankoy or Jankoya in the poetry of the song. Okay, next we're going to move on to another episode, but if we were dealing first in perhaps some facts that you didn't know about, now we're going to a fact that is actually more political theater, and that is the development, the Soviet development or attempt to develop a Jewish national homeland in the Soviet Union. It began this attempt in 1928, and the Soviets declare a national Jewish homeland in 1934 called Birobidzhan. On the map on the upper left, you can see where it is in the Soviet Far East. Looks small, but it's about the size of Belgium. So we're talking about a very significant piece of land. Why did the Soviets do this? Well, in part, it's to provide a Soviet answer to Zionism, to create a Jewish homeland, but a socialist Jewish homeland. And by that, they could then compete with the pull, what they feared was the pull of Zionism for Soviet and other Jews. They called to the Jews of the world also to join them. And as you can see here, and this is entirely a subject of Soviet propaganda. In the end, there were never any more than about 40,000 Jews in Birobidzhan, and that's being very, very generous. It was difficult to get there. It was difficult to live there. And what we can see here on these maps, first of all, is the path of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Jankoy was, Birobidzhan was more or less here. And I'm looking at the upper left map. Along the way on the Chinese border. And this Waldheim colony that you see on the bottom right is identified in the inset map. There's a town called Birobidzhan, which is the capital, of course, and Waldheim, and a number of other Jewish colonies that were set up. But again, none of these succeeded and never were really able to get on their feet for a variety of reasons. Again, distance didn't really interest Jews to go way out there, and the Jewish philanthropic organizations from abroad did not play along. On the upper right, you see what is still to this day the Birobidzhan railroad station, because, and you can see there's also the sign in Yiddish, because to this day in the Russian Federation, Putin's Russia, this is still called, Birobidzhan is still called the Jewish Autonomous Region. Birobidzhan, there are almost no Jews left there. However, they left during the wave of mass immigration in the late 1980s, 1990s. We'll talk more about that next week. Now, in terms of Jewish leadership at this time, it is a very fluid and changing and volatile experience, because the traditional Jewish leadership that we talked about a bit last week, most of it has disappeared. The wealthy Jews, like all other wealthy people, have run away from Soviet Russia because they fear the class warfare that comes along with it. The Zionists that were in Russia, and Zionism was a very strong movement in Soviet Russia, they leave in large numbers during the Russian Civil War. Those that remain behind, I'm talking about the leaders now, are jailed by the Soviet regime in the late 1920s. All of them are eventually, or almost all of them are eventually released and make their way to Palestine. The Jewish socialists, the Jewish socialist parties, for the most part, merged, or were forced to merge more exactly, with the Bolsheviks in the mid to late 1920s. What happens, there was this fear that I talked about a few moments ago, what happens to the rabbis and religious functionaries? By that I mean Jewish butchers, Jewish teachers, rabbis who perform circumcisions. They are restricted by the Soviet regime, mainly by administrative actions. They're not jailed, but they're heavily taxed by the Soviet regime, which discourages many of them for continuing in that profession, and a lot of them migrate out, certainly in terms of their primary professions. And like almost all churches and mosques in the early Soviet Union, most synagogues are appropriated by the regime and their functions turned into something else. But unlike priests and mullahs in the Muslim community, rabbis were never really physically endangered or prosecuted in the Soviet Union. I know this goes against some of collective memory, but as I said last week, part of this mini course is to challenge ourselves with collective memory versus facts. And unlike churches, synagogues, those that were closed and those that remained open, were never robbed of their valuables. They were never looted like churches were throughout the Soviet Union. There are a lot of reasons for this, but we won't go into that. Religious study is actually permitted in the Soviet Union, but in groups of no larger than 3. So the large Jewish schools no longer will operate, but those who seek it can indeed receive religious training. And there's a new network of rabbis created by the Chabad leader at the time, Yosef Schneerson, which creates a nationwide network of rabbis that distributes funds for the upkeep of Jewish institutions wherever they exist. And that network, believe it or not, will continue to exist until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. So if that's what's happening to rabbis, what happens to religious observance? Now, over time, starting in 1917, going all the way to the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's a clear movement towards urbanization amongst Jews, urbanization and acculturation, and then eventually assimilation. That's caused by more and more Jews moving to the cities, where those insular, where the insular shtetl no longer exists. You're no longer under the watchful eye of your parents or the rabbis. And hence, life becomes much freer for these young Jews, and they, by choice, for the most part, are interested in becoming more and more Soviet and abandoning that previous life, including the practice of religion. And so, like in many other places around the Jewish world throughout the 20th century, there becomes a generational divide in the Soviet Union around the practice of religion between older folks who are still practicing and younger folks who are practicing less and less. Now, between 1922 and 1937, there's a very interesting thing going on in the Soviet Union, and that's a national policy that encourages all of the over 100 national minorities in the Soviet Union. Jews are only one of over 100 national minorities to cultivate their own indigenous cultures. That meant that Jews were free and even encouraged by the Soviet regime to strengthen, to grow their Yiddish culture. Hebrew was discouraged because that's considered a national or religious language, but Yiddish was absolutely encouraged by the Soviet regime. And this causes a kind of flowering of Yiddish Soviet culture from the mid-1920s until the late 1930s. This richness came in many, many forms. One of them, oh, I'm sorry, yeah, we had one more poster from Biro Bijan to see, but we're going to move on. One of these forms was a state-sponsored Yiddish theater that paid for Yiddish theater troupes throughout the Soviet Union. There were dozens of them, but the mothership was the State Soviet Yiddish Theater in Moscow. And one of its stars, not the only one, but one of its stars was a gentleman in the middle by the name of Solomon or Shlomo Mechoils. We'll encounter him later. He will become very important to our story next week. But we see him here on stage. This theater company, especially in Moscow, was hugely popular even among non-Jews who didn't know a word of English because of its, evidently because of its very high quality of artistic performance. But there's also an explosion during these years, late 20s into the 30s, of Yiddish language literature. And this included important authors who were returning, Jewish authors, who were returning from exile. They come back to the Soviet Union in the late 1920s and the 1930s, and they participate in this rebirth. And just to give you one quick number, the peak year of Yiddish book production in the Soviet Union is 1932, a year that we wouldn't really think would be a peak of Yiddish literature production in the Soviet Union. And they published, these are Soviet-funded presses, published 688 books in Yiddish in that year. These same government-funded presses also published a lot of Yiddish language newspapers, and we see one of them here that is being read by Jewish colonists in the area of Stalindorf, which today is Dnieper or Dniepropetrovsk, and called Dniepropetrovsk for most of the Soviet period. And what happens? What happens with education? Here too, with the Soviet policy of indigenization, allowing for Yiddish language schools, there is an explosion of these secular Yiddish primary and even secondary schools. And by the mid-1930s, about half of all Jewish children are studying at state-sponsored Yiddish schools throughout the Soviet Union. But very quickly, those numbers begin to decline to almost nothing. And by 1937, the time that this policy is canceled, there are very few students enrolled in any of these schools. There are a number of reasons for that. And in general, there are a lot of debates amongst historians why the cultural renaissance, this Yiddish cultural renaissance, begins to decline in the Soviet Union. If it's education or Yiddish literature or theater, why does it decline in the late 1930s? Well, for one, the policy is abandoned, so there's less money to go around for all of these national minorities to fund these theaters and newspapers and so on. But also, on the one hand, we have, starting in the mid-1930s, Joseph Stalin, who has become the dictator of the Soviet Union, is actively seeking to Russify all of the nationalities, like Nicholas I, Tsar Nicholas I, that we talked about 100 years earlier. And he wanted all cultural production in the Soviet Union to reflect what was called at the time socialist realism. There was no more room for national artistic production. But on the other hand, there's another fact, and that is that by the time this policy, which encouraged national art, was abandoned in 1937, many Jews had already made a choice, an internal choice, that they wanted their children to learn Russian or to learn in Russian and not in Yiddish, because they very much wanted their children to actively engage in this flowering Soviet economy. And the only way they were going to do that is if they knew fluent Russian and could succeed in this new world using Russian language and Russian cultural norms. This period featured, as I said before, a really stellar upward trajectory. And if I were to kind of give you a brief Hall of Fame summary, if we move aside for a moment from the Bolshevik rulers and we look towards extraordinarily successful Jews in other parts of the Soviet reality, there are three examples here. On the left, Jan Gamarnik, who was the son of an office worker in Zhytomyr, in a fairly small town in Ukraine, who joins the Bolshevik Party in 1916. He eventually becomes the Commissar of Defense. However, and many other very, very prominent roles. Here we see him as, in his role in 1933, as the Red Army's political director. It's a different kind of army with ideological needs. He, however, is purged, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. He is purged in 1937, along with hundreds of thousands of other prominent Soviet citizens. He committed suicide while imprisoned after having been purged, and eventually his wife will also pass away while incarcerated in a Soviet political prison camp. On the bottom, we see a very different example. Abram Yoffe, who is considered to this day the father or a father of physics in the Soviet Union. He's a pioneer in the research, global pioneer in the research of semiconductors. He helped found the Leningrad Physical Technical Institute in 1923, which trained generations of elite Soviet physicists. He died of natural causes much, much later, but was forced to retire in the early 1950s. We'll talk about that next week. And the one that I find most interesting is Mikhail Koltsov, born Friedland, not Koltsov. He's the son of artisans from Kiev. He joined the Bolshevik Party in 1917 and fought in the Civil War. He was a journalist. He founded a number of magazines that were about popular satire and commentary. He was even on the editorial board of Pravda, the main newspaper, or one of the two main newspapers in the Soviet Union, starting in 1922. He eventually became the editor-in-chief of Pravda in 1938. He went to Spain, and here it gets really interesting. He went to Spain to report on the Spanish Civil War, but that was only a cover. He was actually sent there by Stalin as an advisor to the local Communist Party and the Spanish Republic, the Republican government. And he's captured, for those of you with a love of literature, his role there was captured by Ernest Hemingway, who depicted him as the character Kharkov in For Whom the Bell Tolls. So he too, sadly, was swept up in the purges, accused in 1938 of anti-Soviet activities, and executed in 1940. There's one more that I'll show you, but only briefly. Maxim Litvinov, he also adopted a different name. You can see his original name from the shtetl, who eventually rises to be the Commissar of Foreign Affairs, the face of the Soviet Union, quite literally, for well over 9 years. As I said before, the traditional Jewish leadership exited the country by the end of the 1920s. So who arises instead? There are three organizations that I'll talk about very, very briefly. None of them, however, are truly representative of Soviet Jewry. I'm not sure that the traditional leaders were representative either, but these all had some connection to the Soviet regime. The first was called the Jewish Sections of the Communist Party. The Jewish Sections of the Communist Party, or in Russian, Yevsektia. These were hardcore, for the most part, hardcore Jewish communists who were prepared and worked towards making all Jews better socialists, better communists, and less Jewish. So that's at one extreme. We have two organizations, we already encountered them, two organizations, one's called Ozet and the other is called Komzet. The names are less important. These are two Soviet Jewish organizations that are created to support and encourage and to even fundraise for Jewish agricultural colonization in the Soviet Union. It's an extraordinary feat and an extraordinary idea that you have a Soviet agency or two agencies really, that work energetically for 15 years to promote Jewish agricultural colonization in the Soviet Union. And finally, we have the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, that I'll talk about more next week, that's created by the Soviets in the summer of 1941, just after the Second World War reaches the Soviet Union, mainly for propaganda purposes, but again, we'll talk much more about it next week. So from here, we move into a painful period in the Soviet Union. If until 1935, with all of the problems that the Soviet Union had been encountering, it did seem in the Soviet Union and beyond in most of the world that the Soviets had kind of captured lightning, had created a new kind of system that really could bring a sort of justice and equality and development to the world that was really unprecedented for its time. But things began to change radically within the Soviet Union around 1934, 1935, the beginnings of Stalin's great purges. Time is short, so I really can't get into much of an explanation of this. But most importantly, for our purposes, this also changes things for the Jews of the Soviet Union, but in perhaps some unexpected ways. What it does do through this process of arrest, quick trial, most of the time by a kind of military tribunal, and the immediate execution of anyone Stalin had perceived to be as a political enemy. This is the first stages of the purges. A large number, almost all of the old Bolsheviks, those who had facilitated, who had mobilized for the revolution in 1917, were put to death. by Stalin and his henchmen. Within them, as we already know, there's a disproportionate number of Jews. I've listed on the left the most prominent of them with one question mark. I could never figure out if Nikolai Kristinsky was actually Jewish. He was a convert. I don't know exactly what he considered himself. And beside their names, their party names, their original names, as you can see, these were very traditional Jewish names that they abandoned at some point as they became engaged in the socialist movement in Russia or in exile. So this was a devastating blow to the presence of Jews in the highest political hierarchy. Of course, we already know that Jan Gamarnik, he was not the only, but he was the most prominent Jewish officer in the Red Army to be executed through the purges. Who else were endangered and eventually swept up by the purges? Any artists who were seen as a threat by the regime, who had written, painted, performed anything that was considered anti-Soviet. One of the most prominent names amongst the Jews was Isaac Babel, who we see here. The name may or may not be known to you. He's considered one of the most important Jewish authors of the 20th century. As you can see on the top left, in his heyday, when he was really the darling of Soviet literature, on the bottom, his mugshot just after arrest. He would die shortly thereafter in a gulag from exposure, as many prisoners did. And perhaps surprisingly to some, a monument to his memory created by the city of Odessa, where he lived much of his life, in 2011, out of recognition for his contribution to the city through his literature. Who else was victimized? Anyone in the Soviet Union who had a connection, real or imagined, to Westerners. In this case, a character that I would assume few, if any, know, Samuel Lubarsky, who was the the director of the Joint Distribution's colonization program in the Soviet Union. A trained agronomist, a very gifted administrator, and he and the rest of the Agro Joint, meaning that same organization created by the Joint to fund and to execute this colonization, almost all of the top administrators of the Agro Joint were rounded up and executed between 1937 and 1939, as well as most members of the Yevsektia, those Jewish sections of the Communist Party, Komzet, Ozet. You might be interested to learn what happened to our friend Rybak, the painter. Well, it turns out that he died of natural causes in 1935 at 38 years old in Paris. So he, I have very few doubts, escaped a much more bitter fate by virtue of having migrated elsewhere. Now, along with these tragic facts, there are a number of inconvenient facts for Jewish observers around Stalin's purges. The first is that until the death, or more exactly, the purge of Yagoda, who we met last week, there were a disproportionate number of NKVD, meaning Soviet secret police officers, who were of Jewish origin. That means that directly and indirectly, and we can like that, we can have our opinions about this, but Jews were involved directly or indirectly in the execution of tens of thousands and the exile to Siberia of hundreds of thousands of innocent Soviet citizens during the time of these purges. The second inconvenient fact is that tensions around the involvement of Soviet Jews like Yagoda and others in crimes against Ukrainians and Lithuanians, those tensions still exist today. They still exist today. As a scholar and as a public activist, I encounter them on occasion. This subject is hot even today. Again, there are many names, not just Yagoda. And the third inconvenient fact, like the rest of the Soviet population at the time, Jews had been brainwashed by Soviet, the state media. And so many, I don't know if most, but many Soviet Jews believed, like their non-Jewish counterparts, that those who were punished by the purges actually deserved it. All of these things we have to keep in mind when we look back in a sort of sober way on this past. Going forward on the timeline, we're drawing nearer to the greatest tragedy of the Jewish people in the 20th or any other century, and that is the Second World War and the Holocaust. And for a moment or two, I'd like to describe, well, what's the situation of Soviet Jews in 1939, 1940, just before the war begins? Well, I would say it's one big paradox, the situation of Soviet Jews in these years. If we take material or data from the Soviet census of 1939, which is problematic, historians argue about these things, but we won't. What do we learn? Well, we learn that Jews are about 1.8% of the total Soviet population. That's about 3 million people, but they're only 1.5% of the Gulag inmates, those inmates who have been purged and have been exiled to the various Soviet labor camps. So they're a lower percentage of the Gulag population than they are of the general population. Something to keep in mind when we think about repression. In 1939, 80% of all Jews in the Soviet Union are already urban. And of those 87%, meaning the shtetl is in the past, within 15, 20 years, Soviet Jews have urbanized. But not only have they urbanized, about half of those 87% were in the really big cities of the Soviet Union: Moscow, Kiev, Odessa, and Leningrad. But they're always a very small minority there. There can be 200,000 Jews or 300,000 Jews in these cities, but they're never going to constitute more than 14% of that city. Jews, again, judging by the census data, are moving very quickly from blue-collar professions, from being lathe operators, let's say, or steel forgers, into administrative roles. That's happening very, very quickly. And Jews are having a stellar surge in terms of their education. In 1934, 1935, Jews comprise almost 20% of all the graduate students in the Soviet Union, in all areas of studies. Again, almost 20% of the graduate students, but Jews only constitute less than 2% of the entire Soviet population. Now, in 1941, June of 1941, Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa. But before that, meaning the invasion into the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union, of course, is involved in the war even before that. How so? By virtue of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty that I would imagine most of us have heard of, the Soviet Union annexes between 1939 and 1940 areas that we see here on the map, so that about a third of the Second Polish Republic, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and Bessarabia, Moldova of today, are annexed by the Soviet Union. Again, between 1939 and 1940, these almost 2 million people become Soviet citizens. Now, keep in mind, these areas had been part of the Russian Empire until 1918. So in a way, these people are being reabsorbed into Russian-speaking space. But they've lived the last 20-ish years in nation states that have very different characters, and nation states that never repressed religion. They might have repressed Jews, but they never repressed Judaism or any other language. But as a consequence, almost all Soviet Jews in 1941 live very close or in the area that the Germans are about to invade. Now, one of the most underappreciated aspects of the Soviet Union and Soviet Jewry during the Second World War is the degree to which the Soviet Union, that same dictatorship ruled by Stalin with his iron fist, is actually a refuge for a lot of East European Jews and Soviet Jews during the course of the war. And this begins immediately after Molotov-Ribbentrop is signed and enacted, with a wave of Polish Jews who want to flee, those who are in the German zone of occupation and those who are in the Soviet zone of occupation, they want to flee eastward into the depths of the Soviet Union to get as far away as they can from the German army and what they know is coming. So these are the first waves that go in. Now, generally speaking, that means that the annexations of these areas are probably a good thing in the end for those Lithuanian, Polish, Latvian, and so on Jews. It's true that up to about 100,000 of these Jews are deported by the Soviets. The Zionist leaders, some of the rabbis, some local leaders are deported to Siberia. The good news is that those 100,000-ish people survived the war in those locations. Now, the newest facet of research about the Second World War, at least in Russia, is the evacuations. These evacuations that I talked about, and here I'm just going to be very, very brief. The Soviets decide to evacuate both civilian populations, governmental infrastructure, and their industry from anywhere that they believe the Germans might invade and occupy. In the course of these evacuations, hundreds of thousands of Soviet Jews, as you can see by the vectors on these maps, again, these are not just Jewish maps, they're general maps, are relocated into the internal areas of the Soviet Union, to places with names that most of us and a lot of these Soviet Jews had never heard of before. But in these places like Tashkent, Almaty, Karaganda, Krasnoyarsk, their Soviet industry and Soviet farming is reconstituted, far away from the invading German armies. Now, we get briefly, and towards the end of our talk today, because it's unavoidable, of course, to discuss the Holocaust in the Soviet Union. Until very recently, this was another understudied topic for a variety of reasons. So, in terms of analysis, what's unique and what's not about the Holocaust on Soviet soil? Well, first, in the case of the Soviet Union, most of the killing, most of the murdering, and there will be almost 3 million deaths of Soviet citizens over the course of the war. Most of it will occur not in ghettos and not in concentration camps and not in death camps, rather in execution sites by SS soldiers and their local accomplices. Perhaps the most well-known of these is Babi Yar. And we see outside the city of Kiev, where the Jews of Kiev were marched over the course of several days, and we see a photograph on our left of them being marched out to a ravine outside of Kiev. And we see that ravine on the right as it was photographed following the Soviet reconquest of the area in 1943. So in that sense, the outcomes are different means of killing, different pace of killing, and much lower possibility of survival. If you were located in German occupied Soviet territory, you had no more, and these are horrible statistics, but they are the facts, you had no more than 10% chance of survival. That's the lowest anywhere in Europe, for the reasons that I described before. However, the regime is actively, as I mentioned before, actively supporting and facilitating eastward evacuation. So if you can get out of the line of fire, chances are you are going to survive. There are very different outcomes for the different kinds of Soviet Jews. The European Ashkenazis, as I said, killing rates between 90 to 99%, depending on where you were. By contrast, non-Ashkenazic Jewish communities, their survival rates were almost 100%, almost 100%. And I sent you a very short reading to reflect that, about how the mountain Jews, for example, survived, even though the Nazi occupiers were there briefly. Here we see very briefly two maps of the killing sites. So we get an idea of how intense this pattern of murder was. And this would account for almost all of the 3 million Jews, Soviet Jews, killed over the course of about 2.5 years. So this is the southern part of the Soviet Union. This is the more northern part, working up between northern Ukraine and up to the Baltic states. One of the aspects that we in the West very often don't really completely understand is the importance, the crucial importance of service during the Second World War for Soviet Jews. From generals on down, I randomly picked 2 life stories here, or 2 service records from the very extensive Yad Vashem digital archive, and gave you here a couple of examples of how everyday Jews served in the army. These are everyday Jews who were able to survive the army. All in all, about 400,000 Soviet Jews served in the Red Army during the course of the war. Nearly half of them were either killed or injured during the course of the war, the highest rate of any Soviet nationality. There are lots of reasons for that, but again, time is short. This remains a great source of pride for older post-Soviet Jews. But alongside of service in the Red Army, we have, of course, the partisans. And there were partisan groups, as we know, both in some of the camps that were able to break out of camps, but also in the woodlands and in the swamps around areas of German occupation. Among the more well-known, certainly in Israel, is Abba Kovner, both a poet and partisan leader in Vilna. Abba Kovner would go on to immigrate to Palestine after the end of the war and become a kind of poet laureate of the early country and a source of inspiration through his poetry and during the War of Independence. So how does Soviet Jewry look? And we're coming to an end. I think Nancy is ready for this to come to an end, but we really are. Am I correct?
No, you know me, I could listen forever, but I do want the audience, to our attendees, to have some time for questions.
Yeah. Okay, so very, very quickly. So what does Soviet Jewry look like at the end of the war, May 1945? Like the whole Soviet population that has lost tens of millions of civilians and soldiers, the Jews are devastated from the wartime human and material loss. And it's totally unclear about how much Soviet Jews can talk about their specific loss. Like Jews everywhere in Nazi-occupied Europe, the evacuees, Holocaust survivors, discharged veterans, and former partisans have to decide what to do in the summer of 1945, and they have a number of choices. Do they go back home where they lived until the war started? Does their home even exist anymore? Will anyone let them in because maybe it's been occupied by other people in the meantime? Or should they stay in their place of evacuation or where they got discharged from the Red Army at the end of the war? Maybe they should settle elsewhere in the USSR, or the evacuees that came from other countries, let's say Poland, should they repatriate to Poland, which is equally devastated, or should they remain in the Soviet Union, or maybe try to emigrate entirely from Eastern Europe and go to Palestine or somewhere else? All of these options, for the most part, were open to them. As a result of the war also, and these evacuations that we talked about, Soviet Jewry is much more dispersed than it was until 1941. And so there will be Jewish communities, totally new Jewish communities, in places like Irkutsk in Siberia, Karaganda, Karaganda in Kazakhstan, and Vladivostok in the Soviet Far East on the Pacific Ocean. What does that mean to the regime? Well, for one, it means that the Jews aren't as important anymore because they're not concentrated around the western borderlands of the Soviet Union. And it also means that because they've been dispersed like this into much smaller communities, trends of assimilation and acculturation and then assimilation will get much, much more rapid. And we'll begin to see something that we almost saw nothing of before the Second World War, which is intermarriage. Jews marrying non-Jews. It almost didn't happen before 1939, and it will become extremely common starting in 1945. But these Jews, those who have survived with all of the suffering, they are grateful to the Soviet Union for having crushed the German army, saved them from fascism, and for the most part, proud of their own service, either theirs or their relatives' service and sacrifice in the Red Army or in the partisan groups. So thank you. And for the time that the boss allows, we'll take some questions.
Well, you know, the boss couldn't listen to this kind of material for a long time, but I do want to give our attendees some questions. So I'm going to go to the chat, and I've taken notes on it. So let me get to those questions. Can you speak, and this is, again, a question, I guess I would say Jewish mobility, and I'm collapsing a couple of questions, but can you talk about Jews in higher education or Jews in the white collar professions, both in the, interwar Soviet period and then a little bit afterwards? What is, if you will, the regime's attitude towards Jews as part of the literate bourgeoisie? I mean, it's a big question, but if you can address that, that'd be helpful.
Well, bourgeoisie would not be the term that's used. It would be in the elites, in the cultural elites, in the educational elites. And it was extremely welcoming. There's simply no other way to put it. It was extremely, Jews were welcomed. And this, to a degree, was both political and a marriage of convenience. Political because it was very important for the Soviet regime, be it Lenin or Stalin, to show the world how much this new socialist regime was different in every way from what had come before, from the autocratic czars. One of the ways that it wanted to show was that it was a Garden of Eden for all of these national minorities. And of course, the most repressed minority before 1917 were the Jews, which was true. And so who better to be the poster children for this new wonderful Soviet world than Jews? So on that part, the Soviets had they motivated themselves to elevate Jews. But I said marriage of convenience because the Jews also, for the most part, happened to be positioned wonderfully to take advantage of this new Soviet world. They knew how to read Russian. Understand that in 1917, fewer than 10% of all Soviet citizens knew how to read Russian. Whereas Jews were already getting close to 50% of Jews knew how to read Russian, and almost all of them knew how to read Yiddish, and many, many knew Hebrew. They were already prioritizing education, and again, they were trusted for the most part. Part of this is just a positive stereotype. They were less drunk and less corrupt than many of their non-Jewish counterparts. Other minorities enjoyed this. For example, certainly until the 1930s, the German Russians, there was actually a fairly sizable community of ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union, and they were also trusted over the years because of the same qualities.
Right, and then later, though, of course, we'll have the complexities of Jews being perceived as dominant in the elite, right? It's always that strange liminal reality for Jews.
Next week, we will certainly talk about a change in that climate towards Jews. It will change, but it will change after the war for a variety of reasons, but we'll get to that next week.
So someone has a very excellent question about the complexities of the, if you will, the nationalities policy that Stalin inherited from Lenin. I'm ad-libbing here, the Soviet Union saw itself as anti-nationalist, but when the Soviet Union was created, it had to deal with the fact that there were so many ethnic minorities in the Soviet Union. It kind of had to nod to them a little bit. So the question, though, and that's part of the support of Ukrainian and Yiddish and Belarusian and other ethnic language cultural institutions. But an attendee has a question. Stalin came to power in 1926, right? What year did Stalin come to power?
It was a gradual process. By 26, 27, he was in control.
So why did it take so long? This is a question from our attendee, for Stalin to adapt Russification, that is, to reject this kind of ethnic the linguistic diversity that characterized the late 20s and the 30s. Why did it take so long for him to change his mind about that?
Yeah. Well, it's a
Yiddish
very
culture,
broad,
etc.
yeah, it's a very broad question, and I can't possibly answer in just a couple of sentences. But the short answer would be that it was a utilitarian change for him and for the regime as a whole. As he's assuming control in the mid 1920s, he's got bigger fish to fry. He's got to consolidate his control. He's got to get rid of political competitors. He's got to mobilize the Soviet economy. And that's going to take a number of years, a couple of 5-year plans later, when on the one hand, he feels more empowered and he doesn't want to create, because he fears, and rightfully so, that by restricting the national autonomy or the cultural autonomy of these minorities, he could create an awful lot of trouble domestically. He's not confident enough that he has the regime has the ability to both mobilize the economy, get rid of internal enemies, and then put down popular revolts, that he is going to he's going to wait. And it's mainly going to wait until he understands, and this is my interpretation, that he understands that a war in Europe is inevitable, which comes around 1935, 1936, with the rise of Hitler and the increasing certainty that the Western allies have no intention of deterring him. And so Stalin understands that his country is headed to war. He doesn't know against who, but he absolutely wants to ensure that there's total loyalty. And therefore, it's time to eliminate whatever is left. And again, the Jews and the Belarusians and others are much the same. By the time the cancellation of the policy comes around 1937, most of these national minorities, certainly the European ones, they've already more or less lost interest in developing their own national culture. They want to be Soviets in all respects. So it's a complex answer to what would seem like an obvious question.
No, I think that and again, I'm speaking now as a little bit of an insider, but that's okay. I think that for many in the West, people don't understand that the project of the Soviet Union was a project of modernization, and many Jews were eager to participate in this. Not all Jews, but many Jews were eager to participate in it, and felt Soviet already by the late 30s, for sure. Not all, but many did. So here's a question that will speak to your heart a little bit more. I mean, not that all this doesn't. Someone is asked about the use of modern Hebrew in the Ukrainian agricultural colonies, such as Sede Menucha and others, and they're wondering, what is the connection between those agricultural colonies and the nascent Zionist movement? Is there a relationship?
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm going to go back to that slide now.
That's great, thank you.
Oops, sorry, just a moment. I'll get there.
No, you're there.
Okay.
You're there. It's good.
Okay, here we go. Yes, so a good question. And as we can see, there are two, just a moment, there are two blocks of colonies with Hebrew sounding names. Around here, Ma'ayan, Tel Chai, Chaklai, Cherut. I won't bother you with the translations. Those colonies were founded in the 1920s, the early 1920s. Really without the help of anyone. Jews from the former Pale of Settlement who are seeking out better lives given the impoverishment and the other troubles that were in the Pale of Settlement. And they take on, it's their own choosing to take on these Hebrew names. The only ones that considered themselves Zionists, meaning the intent was to create or to build themselves as agriculturalists and then move to Palestine, there were only 3 of them. Of these dozen or so Hebrew-sounding colonies, and that's in Tel Chai, and the other is Mishmar up here, and the third one is Ma'ayan here. That's it. The rest of them were perfectly content being in the Soviet Union and making themselves into a new kind of Soviet peasant. The other Hebrew-sounding names are up here in southern Ukraine, along the Ingulets River. These were colonies that were created, the ones with the Hebrew-sounding names, were created in the 19th century, the 1800s, between 1807 and 1848.
Right,
during the Tsarist period, with names like Sde Menucha, we talked about them a little bit last week, Sde Menucha and others, that the Tsarist regime absolutely allowed them to take on Hebrew names. Now, with the coming of the Soviet regime, there was a requirement in some, but not all cases, to change the name. And so Sde Menucha becomes Kalinindorf. Kalinin was the president. He was sort of this old sagely guy who was the president of the Soviet Union at that time. So they took on his name. He was actually a great friend of the Jews. And Tel Chai was forced to change its name to Zaviet Lenina, which in Russian means the star of Lenin, and a couple others had to. But for the most part, they were allowed, even under the Soviet regime and Stalin, to keep their Hebrew names. It didn't really disturb them that much. So I hope I've answered that question. So in short, they were not Zionists, except for a couple. However, a lot of young colonists from the Sde Menucha area in the 1920s and later on from Tel Chai did wind up emigrating to Palestine for a variety of reasons. And fascinating story in itself, but time is short.
Right. So I want to thank you. I think for so many people, for all kinds of complicated reasons, nostalgia, the trauma of the Holocaust, the Cold War, American triumphalism and exceptionalism, this history is little understood, and the complexities of the regime, of the Stalinist regime, its relationship to Nazi Germany, the Hitler-Stalin Pact, all those things. So I'm personally very grateful for the clarity and the enthusiasm and the images. So thank you so much. We have to say goodnight. We have one more session. I want to thank Hannah Feldman, who's been the tech behind the scenes person, and of course, Karen Small, the managing director, always for keeping everything going at the Bildner Center in this incredibly challenging, continually challenging time. And of course, to thank Jonathan Deckelchen, our visiting scholar. I want to give you a heads up about what's coming up for the Bildner Center on February 11th, which I think is just tomorrow. We have a film discussion with director Deborah Schaffer and pioneering artist Audrey Flack on the documentary film Queen of Hearts, Audrey Flack. I can tell you it's a great film. It's a fascinating subject. Audrey is a photorealist painter and a feminist and very outre, and I urge you to participate, and that's in coordination with the Mason Gross School of the Arts, which of course we always love to do. We have another mini course with our second visiting scholar, Greg Drinkwater, which will begin in March, on Jewish countercultures, remaking American Judaism, 1967 to 1990. Part of that story, by the way, is the fight for Soviet Jewry. So if you're interested in the way American Jews of Ashkenazic origin related to the Soviet Jewry movement, that will come up in that class as well. And then we have 2 book talks by my colleagues, Conversion, Circumcision, and Ritual Murder, A Medieval Mystery Unraveled, March 3rd, Paula Tartikoff in conversation with David Chayovitz, Yiddish, Biography of a Language, the new book by Jeffrey Chandler in conversation with Joshua Lambert. And on March 7th, the Amichai Windows, Rick Black, a book artist, will be in conversation with Professor Gary Rensburg, who consulted on the Hebrew on this wonderful artist book on the poetry of Yehuda Amichai. So please join us for all of these virtual events. And of course, if you have any questions, you know where to reach us. And I look forward to seeing all of you next week. And I want to thank Jonathan again for a great presentation and second session.
See you next week. Thank you.
So good night, everyone.